Good morning, buongiorno. My name is Jonathan Blake. I direct the planetary program at the Berggruen Institute. I'm the co-author with Nils Gilman of Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises. And it is my absolute delight to introduce the distinguished fellow members of the first session of the Planetary Summit. Risa Wechsler, the director of the Kavli Institute for Particle Astrophysics and Cosmology, and professor of physics, particle physics, and astrophysics at Stanford University. Nairi Woods, the founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at Oxford University, and Christine Winter, senior lecturer in politics at the University of Otago. And we're really in for a treat for this next hour and a half, because I can't think of three people who are better suited to speak together and to think together on the subject of the planetary. The range of knowledges that they bring to this topic is itself remarkable, but I think it's also a testament to the intellectual capaciousness and the possibilities that come from this concept, right? That the four of us have come to this idea from radically different backgrounds, yet still find common ground for discussion, a common language for developing new ideas, really gives me a lot of hope, and it makes me very excited for the possibilities of this concept of the planetary from science, philosophy, politics, and governance. So let's welcome our panelists. So to dive in, I find it very helpful to think of the concept of the planetary in contradistinction to that of the global. This is something that Nils just alluded to, but I want to dive in a little bit more. Right, so we think, or in English at least, we use the planetary or the planet and the global or the globe as really interchangeable terms with no distinction kind of in common language. But in fact, I think they carry extremely different and really important differences. And I think this was really well summarized by the eminent historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, who makes the point that the word globe in the word globalization and the word globe in global warming are different words that carry very different meanings. So he says the globe of globalization is a human construct. It's one that we've built and that places our species at the center of it. Right? So we talk about global culture, global capital, the global music industry. These are things that are fundamentally human conceptions. But the globe of global warming doesn't take that perspective at all. The globe of global warming is a much broader, vaster, temporally elongated vision of this world, and really then puts us not as the central actors, but simply as one actor among many. And I think one of our tasks this weekend is to really analyze this distinction and promote this distinction. So to dive in, Risa, let me turn to you. Could you tell us a bit about the Earth as a planet, really as a system that orbits through space?
Yeah, that's great. So I'm a cosmologist, which means that I study the entire universe. So when I think of the Earth as a planet, I start by thinking about the fact that our Earth is in a galaxy that's one of maybe 1 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, that within our galaxy, our planet is surrounding a star that is one of maybe 100 billion stars in our galaxy, and our planet is one of hundreds of gravitationally bound systems that orbit our star, among tens of sort of planet-like systems that could have evolved in many different ways. And so that's my starting point for thinking about the Earth as a planet. And in that context, I think about, what are the conditions that led to life on Earth and the evolution of the Earth, which involve, where our Earth was born as part of the system of planets around our star, what confluence of coincidences had to come about to form our planet, over the last 5 billion years. And And that's the context in which I think of the whole history of our planet and this unique moment that we're in where, as a species, we are for the first time actually impacting our planet on a planetary scale.
So, Christine, kind of building off of this, Risa's remarks about the place of the planet in the cosmos and drawing again on the distinction between the global and the planetary, I'm curious how you might respond to this distinction in this place.
Yeah, I find it very interesting, and I find it very challenging for a couple of reasons. The first one is I come from a culture that thinks locally. Spatially, we think locally. Temporally, we think very broadly. I'm sorry, my watch is talking to me, which is a bit disturbing. So thinking on this planetary scale, for me, is very challenging, but I really like it. And I particularly like Dipesh Chakrabarty's distinction between the global and between the planetary. And I think of the global as being a system of violence, as being just every aspect of the notion of the global is violent. Whereas the planetary, and I'm reverting to the language of some thinking we've been doing this week, the planetary is about flows for me, and whether those flows are cosmic flows or whether they're the simple flows of the canals outside, it's a much more useful way, I think, of thinking to embed ourselves as members of nature, as members of this really broad community of living and non-living things. I'll just stop there.
And Nairi, you want?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I feel like an interloper into a conversation that I don't entirely understand. And I sort of feel that there's much more erudition in the room to make sense. But in a way, I think if I understand the project of Planetary, maybe that's the point, which is to bring analysis and art in a way together. And to have us reframe how we see the world. Nils gave us a very sobering account of the crises that the world faces. And I think my reflection on this work about Planetary is that we do need to shift our lens. And I think Christine and I were talking about, just down the road at the Biennale, there's a Maori women's art collective that have taken the synthetic straps that you use to tie things onto trucks, and using traditional Maori weaving methods, they've created this extraordinary space just by weaving a roof. So you walk into what would be a concrete room, and instead it feels like a magical, ethereal space where by blocking the light, they make you look at the light and recognize it and feel as though you're somewhere quite sacred. And that shifting of the gaze, which artists do and which philosophers can do, although it's more difficult to experience as a non-philosopher, I think is part of what you're doing. So in a much more practical vein as the interloper, my first thought, Jonathan, when you set us this task of thinking of Planetary, was to recall the Reagan-Gorbachev summit of 1985, when the world was also facing a crisis of nuclear escalation, of planetary boundaries. And Reagan said to Gorbachev, well, if we get attacked from out of space, and there were some in the Reagan administration that really believed that you might get attacked from out of space, would you come to our assistance? And Gorbachev thought about it and said, absolutely, we would. So it was a sort of height of Cold War moment where you reframe the problem in that planetary way. You saw a possibility of cooperation. But just finally on this introduction, I'm very skeptical of this notion of planetary governance and very supportive of the other idea I've already heard this morning, which is that by reconceiving the world in a planetary way, to pick up on Christine's theme, we make possible a much greater respect for local governance. And that's a theme I think we'll probably come back to in this conversation this morning.
So I think the story of Gorbachev and Reagan gets to one of the core ideas here, which is that in some senses it's a question of the perspective of scale, right? So if you're the US and the Soviet Union or any other sovereign nation state, and you see your competitors, your enemies, your friends, your allies as other nation states, all of them fiercely attached to this idea of sovereignty. That's a very different politics than the politics of the whole, of the planet as a whole, which of course is this, I guess, alien attack idea, or the Independence Day scenario, if anyone remembers that movie. But for the time being, of course, that's not how it operates, right? It took this discussion of attack from outer space, which is, I guess, sci-fi, basically, to get these two superpower enemies to agree to each other. So is there a way in which the recognition, not that there's potential of an attack from outside, but just that we all inhabit this one planet, this one single whole, is there a possibility that emerges from that recognition?
But I don't think people trust the idea of governing the whole, because only those in control trust the idea of governing the whole, because that's just an expansion of their own control. That we're living in a time where for the last 3 or 4 years, well, in fact, the last decade, the most resonant slogan for people is take back control, because they feel they've lost control. They've lost control of the ability to earn better livelihoods. They've lost control of the ability to believe that their economy can enter the technological race and win. They've lost control over security. And I can't imagine a world in which most people would believe that the solution to that is to give up more control to a planetary governance. I think we've got to align governance with trust, and trust we're seeing is residing more and more at the local level. And if we don't align governance with trust, we're just going to end up with more and more disaffection and distrust.
Okay, so for me, this is a question of how we relate. And part of what the global has done is break up that sense of relating, of relationships, of relating to each other as fellow inhabitants on the earth, of relating to either other people or other cultures or other politics or other beings. And that it is in relationships that we may start to repair. I think relating is very important. The idea of the individual, I think, has become very, very destructive. And we need to start thinking about, okay, I can't live outside of my relationships. There's this expression, isn't there, that you come into the world alone and you leave the world alone. But I don't know about you folks. My mum was there when I was born. I did not come into the world alone. All right? So I think we need to think about how we relate. And what is the quality of our relationships? And what are we doing to support, and I'm sorry, I have to revert to te reo Māori, to a Māori word, how do we support others' mana? How do we show respect to everything else that exists in the world, everyone and everything? And if we start from that, it's a micro-local level, it might ripple out.
So might this conceptual distinction, if the global breaks down relationships, and I agree, might refounding kind of a philosophical political order on the concept of the planetary, does that help us get there? Do you see more relationality more central to the concept of the planetary?
I think relationality is more central to the idea of the planetary, because within the planetary is the notion of flows, is the notion of a whole that is systemic, that is a system. And systems have relationships embedded in them.
And it's, of course, Nairi, I mean, local trust, of course, is also, as if no one is born alone, communities also don't exist alone. So how can we foster relationality if people seem more and more wanting to look inward, right? Really keep things small, take back control. Is there a possibility, though, to understand that these communities sit in relation on one planet, on one interconnected?
Yeah, I think there is. I think it's the relationship between, in this room there's lots of people whose job is to analyze things. And then there are some artists whose job is to create visions of things. And it's how we marry those two together. Because take back control is not a vision, it's a defense. And, I was listening to an Emirati politician 3 weeks ago who began with an extraordinary statement for any European or North American. He said, the purpose of government is to create a vision, is to design a future which gives citizens hope. And I thought, wow, in Europe, I think the essay question is, or the role of government is seen as making up for the disasters of the government that came before, like managing chaos, right? But that idea of designing a future that gives citizen hope, I think there is something, and I said I feel like an interloper. There's something about the way you're using planetary, which I think is a little bit about that, right? It's to sort of shift the vision away from the analytics, which keep taking us to, well, if we just, tighten our fiscal envelope a little and jig our macro policies and do a little bit of investment in these particular industries, we might get there. And what's missing is a vision which gives people hope. And my problem with the word planetary is that I think people need a vision which is closer to them. I don't think most people think of themselves in a planetary way. And so the sovereignty piece is if they really do believe their government is going to take their society to a place which is going to make their lives better, then that's something more tangible. But you'll have to help us understand what planetary is as a vision for the human being that's walking the street, wondering if their children will ever get health care.
Right.
I don't know if I can answer this question, but I really resonate with this idea of thinking about, how do we create hope, and how do we create hope as beings on this planet when we do have these sort of global scale challenges, where we are, in some sense, the first, generation of humans that is actually impacting our planet on a planetary scale. In my view, that I resonate a lot with this local grounding, but local grounding in a way that we need to somehow work together to build this, to build a future that is hopeful, that has a sense of thriving for everyone on the planet, that is, and that has to be grounded in us as beings in concert with the system, with the Earth system, with the climate system, et cetera.
So now I wonder, so one response that I've gotten, not often, but occasionally, when discussing the planetary, is that the concept of the planetary is too cold, right? The planet is a giant rock, or I don't know, with molten rock, and that's kind of out in space. When really I think what we're talking about, what we're trying to refocus, is not about the inanimate, but about the animate. That it's about refocusing on life, but life at a planetary scale, which of course life at a local level is simply one manifestation of. That what's amazing about this planet that we're on is that that it sustains life. And as far as we know, so far, is the only place where that happens. So I'm curious whether part of your resistance is this coldness, when really what we're interested in, what we want to promote, the way in which we want to give hope is through a warmth. So I mean, to open it to anyone, I mean, like, not to throw this whole thing into chaos, but are we using the wrong term? I mean.
I think that's yours, Christine. That's definitely yours.
So is the planetary the wrong term? No, I don't think it is the wrong term. I think it's how we use it that will grant it the power to do the sorts of things that we here in this room are trying to discuss and to work with. At the same time, I think we here in this room, and I might come back to why I keep doing this in a moment. As human beings, everybody, I think, other than Risa, has difficulty thinking beyond the local and that which is close. If we understand that everything is interconnected, that everything is relational, and simultaneously we act locally, and I know there's some horrid whatever it is, metaphors around that. But if we start at the local and then we think about the edges of the local as being fuzzy and overlapping, if we protect our local, that connects with the next locale, that connects with the next locale, so that there is a net of caring around the planet that becomes this thing that is the planetary.
I think, for me, I love that, but for me, planetary, has these two possible sort of routes in my thinking. One is escape. So it's the Musk view, if we completely wreck planet Earth, let's all go and live in Mars, or let's have a safe haven in Mars or something, which I don't think is helpful to the curation of the planet. But the other is perhaps the idea of a sort of planetary repair. And I'm going to go back to the Biennale exhibition where there's the one beautiful, beautiful piece of work, which is gossamer thin silk, in which the artist has torn holes and then darned the holes. And darning does not mean patching. Darning is not overlaying something else. Darning is pulling the very threads of that gossamer silk together to make it even stronger. And I think there's something and it's the artwork is by a Palestinian who's probably thinking about how do you even repair what's, Gaza, et cetera. So it's very poignant. But if we think about planetary repair, I guess my point would be, how do we draw the threads? It's very much what Christine was saying about being rooted. How do we draw the threads that we already have together to make it stronger, rather than imagine ourselves in a spaceship heading towards some other place that we can dominate? I mean, it's I think that's the coldness. Is this a sort of sci-fi, or is this really focusing, which I think is your intent of all of you in the Planetary Project, which is to focus us on much more the repair project of seeing the planet as a whole and thinking about how we work together to kind of draw its threads together and make it stronger.
And I wonder if that connects, I think, to Christine's point about the fuzzy edges. Because I'm thinking now, because I agree with you that the local is obviously extremely important. It's a place where maybe we can build more trust, and we need to now there needs a sense that we need to return after several decades of really looking globally, and then with, the internet and social media, that you just kind of look everywhere. And we know in the United States, for example, we're facing this horrible crisis of loneliness, right? That people feel disconnected. So a return to the local, a return to community. But I think one thing that distinguishes really importantly the local from the national, which is the primary way in which we think politically, is the national has very clear boundaries. Right? There are lines on the map. And you can't cross, I mean, in Europe is an exception, but you can't cross that line without showing your papers, and suddenly you're in a different legal regime, et cetera. But the local, it's much fuzzier, right? City boundaries, unless you're a city official, don't matter to anyone, It's fuzzy. Your community blends into the next community. Neighborhood lines are disputed. Where does my neighborhood end? Is it that block, this block? Tends not to matter. So I wonder if this refocusing on a place where we haven't been drilled to think in terms of strict national, strict binaries or strict distinctions allows the threading together.
So you're sort of saying that, the boundaries, are sort of negative. They're about keeping people out. Whereas the local is, in a way, a project, right? We know that in small localities, there's more trust when people simply smile and say hello to each other, right? So there's a sort of positive definition of the local. People don't even feel part of a community unless there is that, because it's not relying on boundaries to keep others out.
But I think I'm taking from a spatial perspective of, walking around all the, that it's hard to do this process of knitting together across national boundaries, because there are legal regimes that make it difficult. Whereas in a city, in a town, it is more porous, and it allows a recognition of these fuzzy boundaries, that, maybe here's the city, but I can, get in the car and drive to the suburbs, and it's all, it feels connected, and, we know people who live in both, and it allows, okay, but now I'm thinking from the position of these suburbs, and then there's the next suburbs, and then I'm in the next city, and we could start to see this bound together. And in fact, one place where I think you really notice this is basically large urban areas that are divided by a national boundary. So I think San Diego and Tijuana are really one big city, but they have a national boundary between them that causes all sorts of issues, particularly from the point of view of what we're talking, of planetary problems. The flows of air go back and forth. The viruses go back and forth, despite there being, a strictly enforced wall between them. So might this return to the local then be the pathway that, instead of thinking in terms of large national units with strong and distinct boundaries between them, thinking of patchworks of local where there's just a much more easily grasped sense that they're fuzzy boundaries that can be knitted together.
I think it's a really hard ask, because I think what we're seeing politically is a real return of the state and a real return of expectations on governments. People feeling that their jobs and livelihoods are at stake are saying to governments and believing governments that say, don't worry, we'll use tariffs, we'll introduce workers' protections, we will do stuff at the national level to protect you. The people who are worried that they're living in economies that are stagnant are now looking to their governments to do industrial policy, whether it's Europe or the US or Brazil. They're asking for industrial, but at the state level, for state competition. And people feeling insecure because they're worried about the wars that are going on in the world, nuclear proliferation, drone war, the applications of AI to technology. They're looking to their government to defend them. We're seeing defense budgets balloon. And that's a loss of what a decade ago was a world sort of drawn together towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, and saying there is a human project that we're working on together, even as we disagree on all these other things. We're seeing those budgets being redirected into defense. So it's sort of hard for me to see how we then say we should downplay sovereignty. I guess I would come at it saying, how do we then use sovereignty to, and alongside it, within it, and across it, build these other communities, rather than say we've got to overcome sovereignty?
So the ballooning defense budgets kind of nicely tease up something I wanted to return to Christine that you said earlier, but the global being kind of bathed in violence. But it made me think, but in many ways, so is the planetary. I mean, with volcano eruptions, predation, et cetera, and we often think of, I mean, I don't know from whether cosmologists think this way, but I think we often think of the universe as a violent place. So I'm curious, like, the role of violence in the planetary, whether it's such a neat distinction between violent, global, and good, happy planetary.
It's interesting. I want to pick up a wee bit on what Nairi was saying, and then respond to you, John. I wonder if this return to the national is a sort of a last gasp of a crumbling regime, and therefore something like this is the beginning of the hope, is the beginning of thinking differently to step into something beyond this reversion to what we know, because people are fearful, because there seems to be these multiple zones of collapse, whether it's environmental collapse, whether it's statehood collapse, war, those sorts of things. So that's sort of my first thought. My second one is the planet violent? It is. We can't say there is no such thing as violence, and that there is something that we could call a utopia where violence was eliminated. That would be absurd. And the idea of the planetary, I think, is embedding an idea of cooperation, an idea of linkages and an understanding, yes, that perhaps there is violence, but it's violence that in many ways is beyond human control. Mm-hmm. And that the idea of the planetary is encouraging humans to think beyond human-initiated violence, whether it's violence to other people, whether it's violence to the earth. It's about blasting mountains aside so you can get to some coal. It's the violence of saying, oh, well, that species doesn't matter. We want to get to gold because gold is worth so much at the moment. Let's forget the fact that there is a frog that's threatened here. We'll just move on. The idea of the planetary, I think, is moving us beyond that sort of deliberate violence and accepting that, yeah, violence exists.
Yeah, I'm not, no, Risa, no, go.
Well, I think it's interesting to, I mean, yes, the universe is quite violent on its own without humans. That things are happening on very large scales. The formation of the Earth was quite violent, and actually many of the events that led to life on Earth are violent. We probably, the volcanoes that played a key role in stimulating life on the planet. The last major meteor impact, which played a key role in enabling mammals to flourish on the planet. And so I think those things are a reality. I think they are distinct in some ways from human threats. And I think, kind of coming back to this question of, how do we collaborate as a human species? And there's two sort of distinct categories of planetary threats that I think we need to think about. One is human created, and that involves the fact that we are impacting our climate, the fact that we are threatening ourselves with nuclear war, but it also includes these external things. I mean, I'm less worried about an alien species coming down, but but eventually there will be another large meteor, and we, as a planetary species, if we want to survive on the long time scale, will need to work together to mitigate that. So I think that violence, both human created and intrinsic to the physical system are things that ideally really should engender collaboration and you know, thinking about our relationships not only with each other, but with the physical system that is the planet.
And I wonder if, I really like that, but I wonder if using the word violence simultaneously to describe a volcano and an attack by other human beings is blurring what we most need to notice, which is that in the face of volcanoes, tsunamis, you know, I'm a sailor, in the face of a storm, you're reminded, you know, you're forced to be humble as a human being in the face of nature. Whereas in the face of an attack by other human beings, your instinct, of course, is to fight. And if we just think about the difference that fear and anger bring about in human beings, you know, fear and anxiety bring about risk aversion in human beings, whereas anger brings about massive risk-taking. And so and maybe that helps the way the planetary does the work. So the volcanoes might make us more humble, might make us more risk-averse, more prone to finding solutions, maybe.
Yeah.
And whereas the human-on-human violence perhaps makes us more prone to anger, to risk-taking, to non-cooperative solutions.
I was thinking the same question, whether violence is really the right term to describe the universe, right? Because you know, violence carries you know, moral and ethical charge that seems inappropriate cosmically. Because maybe this brings us back to, is it maybe it's apparent, but like, and I want you to tell more about this in a second, but like the Big Bang, right, seems to me at least, not know anything about it, a moment of immense violence and creation.
Yeah, I don't think of it as violent at all, actually, that particular moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I don't know anything, that's fine.
So are we thinking about power rather than violence? Moments
Maybe.
of extraordinarily powerful effect.
Yeah, that might be a better word.
Or energetic,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, energy
rather than
doesn't have to be
violence.
the same as
Yeah,
violence.
that's right.
So,
But tell us about the Big Bang.
yeah, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the beginning. So right, this place, this planet emerged from this cosmic history, right? So Risa, can you set us up with an understanding of our place in the history of the universe? And then I want to think together about what this may or may not change about both our philosophical and political self-conceptions.
So about 13.8 billion years ago, there were quantum fluctuations. Those happen still today, these quantum fluctuations, particles popping in and out of existence. The thing that happened at that time, and I can't really say what happened before or whether there was time before, but the thing that happened at that time was some part of the universe, or our entire universe, started expanding extremely fast. And it expanded so fast that those quantum fluctuations were made macroscopic and actually, essentially, in that first tiny fraction of a second, created all of the matter. Created, you know, the quarks and the electrons, and probably in that first moment also created another kind of matter that does not emit or absorb light, that we call dark matter. And a few minutes later, we formed most of the light elements, hydrogen, helium, lithium, deuterium. That was it in the first few minutes. The universe was expanding and cooling. And the main thing that was happening with this expansion, cooling, and these little quantum fluctuations that started in that first moment started to pull things to them. Like places that were a little bit dense became more and more dense just due to the force of gravity. And that cooling enabled new things to happen. So about 400,000 years later, the universe got cool enough that atoms could form, that electrons could hold on to their nuclei, and light just free streams to us from that time. A few 100 million years later, those clumps of matter that gravity had pulled together actually became dense enough that we got some clumps that were maybe, let's say, 100 million times the mass of the sun. And once you got a clump that big, you could start to actually pull gas together, and that gas could start to cool. And that cool gas could form the very first star. The very first star in the universe, which happened in probably the first 500 million years, was probably quite heavy. It formed out of a cloud of gas. That gas only had these light elements, and that created a very massive star. That massive star very quickly exploded, and in its core created all kinds of other elements. All of the things that you and I are made of, created in that star and in the next generation of stars. And already the next generation of stars was completely different because it was made out of this previous generation that created the heavier elements. And then, gravity continued to do its thing, pulling things together, forming stars in different regions. About 9 billion years later, there was a cloud of gas, maybe 1,000, 10,000 times the mass of the sun, and that cloud of gas, which we call a molecular cloud, condensed and formed a population of stars, one of those stars being our sun. So this was about 4.6 billion years ago. Our sun, which was created with a sort of planetary disk of gas and dust that was spinning around it, and eventually that disk of gas and dust turned into, basically fragmented, and lots of collisions happened and formed our planetary system with a handful of planets, some moons, and our Earth.
Can I ask Risa something? Yeah, what's that?
To answer
We're all going to sign up for astrophysics, but could I ask Risa just one thing? I mean, it's amazing to me that your professional life has you thinking in terms of billions of years. Yeah. Does that change the way you live? I was sitting there going, what's the significance of a birthday? If you go to work and you're thinking, was it 9 billion years or was it 8 billion years? Does it change your...
I think it changes some things about the way I live. I mean, I'm still a human. I have emotions and, irrationalities and many other things. But it does, I do find that it grounds me, actually. I feel like it helps me think about, who humans are as a species, where we are in time, this sort of magical moment. I mean, I feel incredibly lucky. This shocks me every time I think about it, that, I am part of the generation of humans that got to know this story that I just told you. Mm-hmm. We didn't have that story 100 years ago. And maybe we'll have a different story in the future. My guess is we will have still this story with more layers on it. And that's exciting. But I feel incredibly lucky to be sort of part of the generation of humans that got to know what is the universe made of. Mm-hmm. This, to me, it does tie back in some ways to how I think of myself as a human on this planet.
Well, let's throw the question back to you. Now that you know this, how might you live differently?
I feel so much younger.
But to take back to the questions that you think about in your professional life, I mean, how does this change? How should it change? How might it change how we operate politically in this world?
It's just really hard to get beyond the kind of insignificance, right? Yeah. Except that what Risa said is really profound about this generation being a generation that has unpacked that story, which which gives you significance. I don't know. I really don't know. It made me think, though, for Christine, about the Maori creation narrative, and which you might share. I don't know, but
I can share bits of it. I'm not steeped in the creation myths, but you know, the Maori perspective is that there was a moment before creation, which is which is called the kaore, which means the void, a moment when there was nothing. And then there was creation. And then we had, you know, the earth was made, things were made, things arose. What it leads to, and it picks up a word that has been hovering in this conversation but hasn't been used, I don't think. At the end of the creation, at the end of this myth of creation, this story of creation, I'm not going to use the colonial term that is a myth, it is a myth, it is a story. It isn't, as Risa says, you have a story.
Yeah.
Yeah, Maori have a story. At the end of that story, humans were made. Humans are regarded as the younger sibling of all creation. As a younger sibling, we are humble. As a younger sibling, we have responsibilities too, the elders that are everything else that exists. And it twists, it moves the way you look at the world. It moves you beyond the hubris of, and God made man to dominate the world. It moves you to a position of responsibilities, not a position of rights. And I think that's very, very different. It's a very different picture. May I pick up something quite different from Risa's story? At the moment of seconds after the Big Bang, stuff was created, the gases were created. What I sit with often, that absolutely blows my mind, is that hydrogen was one of those elements. Each one of you is 10% hydrogen. No other hydrogen has been made since then. Where the devil has that hydrogen been before it became part of you? What's it been doing? You know, what's it caused? And now it's part of you. What's it doing in you? Part of you is how many billion years old?
13.8.
10% of you is 13.8 billion years old. Ooh. I don't know what to do with that. It's simultaneously exciting and absolutely terrifying.
yeah.
And it's about how we relate. You know, we're not just this isolated individual.
Yeah, I find it quite profound to think about where the hydrogen in our body has been, and you know, the cycle it went through as you know, within our galaxy, within that cloud of gas that formed our planetary system, right? That was, you know, multiple light years across. You know, the hydrogen atoms in your body. And, you know, and then what it has been doing for the last 4.6 billion years on our planet, which has been, you know, quite a history.
And I think it makes me think about how it is that humans react to the unfamiliar, right? So in the face of the unfamiliar, we either have a positive story, which makes it fun. So, and I think about the voter who was asked after a Trump rally, you know, what do you think? And he said, I think Space Force sounds really cool, right? And the journalist sort of said, well, what is it? Like, what is Space Force? And he said, well, I don't know, it's like a force in space. And, but he liked the sound of it, right? It sounded really cool. But that's the sense making, that's the, how do we craft a story that makes sense of the unfamiliar so that human beings will want to discover it and find some delight in it. And planetary, there's a lot of science fiction that shapes the way we think about space and our relationship to space, which I think it's important for us to take into account to understand how our imagination is shaped. Because the other human reaction, if we're not given a story which makes us curious and eager to discover, then most human beings react to the unfamiliar by taming it and making it something familiar to them. Most CEOs or heads of organizations come in and immediately try to make the organization just like the one that they're familiar with. Most academics and scholars go to places in the world they're unfamiliar with and immediately slot everything they see into what they know, right? So that's a different sense of how we cope with the unfamiliar. So I think we've got a job to do in creating the story that helps people come to this with a different sense.
But one thing that maybe could be drawn on here, and that just came up, is on the one hand, there's a scientific story that we're now learning more and more about. But of course, every tradition, cultural tradition on Earth has some sort of creation story themselves. So there are a lot of different resources that kind of give us a perspective of deep time. And how might we harness that? Can these be sources of a shared narrative that builds on relationships and mutuality, right? Just to take to push a little further, because the scientific story, right? The story of that the hydrogen in me right now was somewhere else. And I think one thing for me that was really brought to mind during the pandemic was just, even though I guess we all know that we share air, share breath, but suddenly this became front of mind all the time. That what you breathe out, I breathe in. So there is, at a molecular level, at an atomic level, this sharing. And so I wonder, what can we do with that, right? Because it is often made, claims of sharing, of mutuality, of relationships are often made in the realm of religion, in the realm of ethics, of morality. So I think when Martin Luther King talks about the inescapable, I think, cloth of mutuality, right? He's making a moral claim. But of course, underneath that, or parallel to that, is an atomic claim. So what can we do with this?
Stay humble. It creates in us, I hope, a sense of awe and a sense of humbleness. And it's a long way away from international politics, and it's a long way away from local politics. And it gives us, food for thought, gives us a moment of identifying with our own insignificance, and I hope that makes us humble. It seems to me that a lot of our problems, a lot of the planet's problems, I'll use "our" in that way now, are generated by hubris, are generated by an idea, a myth, a conception that mankind, actually men, are powerful, that they have control. That control is very illusionary, and this moment is telling men that it is illusionary. So anything that keeps us humble is a good thing.
I agree with what you said, and it was brought up in the introduction about how the pandemic sort of, in many ways, brought to the fore both our interrelation with each other and our interrelation with the planet. That moment when birds started to sing in places that they hadn't been singing, and the air started to clear, and it was top of mind for all of us. But you know, I think we have this really interesting relationship right now with control that, you know, we are now as a species impacting our planet on timescales that are beyond our own. And, you know, there are, if you look at deep time, you know, these things have happened before, climate cycles have happened before, but it is different in this time. This is a unique moment in the history of our solar system, at least, that, you know, that a species on our planet is actually impacting the long-term dynamics of the planet. And I think that is very both humbling and I think should be sobering about our own power. And how we use that power and how we think about that power.
Yeah, I think every one of us has multiple identities, one of which we just discovered today is our shared hydrogen. But I wouldn't put too much weight on our shared hydrogen holding us together in the face of any crisis. And I just think of the way the disappointment that Nils noted, that of those thinking that an external threat, so climate or pandemics or nuclear extinction, will somehow draw human beings together. And it overlooks the fact that most human beings face much more imminent threats. So I remember during the first lockdowns of COVID, the meme from Nigeria is we you know, our only choice is go out to find food or die at home of starvation. Like, COVID is the lesser threat to us, right? Yeah. And it's to think about, you know, how do you work with that which is most threatening? I was sitting on the board of the Van Leer Foundation, which was trying in the Middle East in Israel, in Jerusalem, over the last 10, 15 years, to put together a sort of sense, a much more complex sense of Israeli identity, and to uncover all the different roots of Israeli identities. And in particular, the very large percentage of Israelis that have an Arab-Jewish grandparent or great-grandparent, and to sort of weave that into the national narrative. And what I found intriguing was to watch them go out, this group of Israeli researchers, to go out to their own communities and to say to people, you know, do you have Arab heritage? And the answer would be, absolutely not, I'm Jewish. And they would say, yeah, but do you have an Arab Jewish grandmother? And the person would say, well, yes, of course. So these questions of identity become so contingent on people's sense of fear and safety and threat, that I'm not sure I would need to get you, Jonathan, to help me understand why the shared planetary identity, like, how would you awaken that in people when their other identities seem so much more urgent and salient to them?
I mean, it's obviously an extremely important question. I mean, my view is the history of identity, of political identities in particular. You know, the story that every nation tells themselves is, you know, we were a glorious nation since time immemorial, and at one point we rose up to form our own state, and now here we are, and we get to, you know, live in the state of our name, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, that's almost never actually how it happened, right? The peasants didn't have national identities, right? The stories of the state being formed and then the state forming the people. I mean, most famously is right here. I mean, Venice is actually a particularly interesting case because, you know, it had its own very distinct non-Italian identity, but, you know, one of the famous Italian nationalists said, well, we built Italy, now we must build Italians. So I suspect that the relationship between kind of working at the planetary scale and people identifying in some planetary way, probably it's the, we need to work first and then identities will follow. But well, if you want to respond or?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm interested.
So, but I think that the relationship, identity we often think of in binaries, right? the example you just gave is precisely that. But Christine, this is something that you've written about really beautifully on a number of different levels, and I want to have you help us push through thinking in binaries. So in a recent essay, you argued that, quote, the divide between the living and the non-living, the human and the non-human, and these are, of course, the ultimate binaries, you write, is a convenient fiction. In reality, these dichotomous categories are integrally bound up in relations at all sorts of scales. So I'm hoping, could you expand on this thinking?
Well, I think perhaps I can start with your story about the breath. We're all sitting in here, breathing in everybody else's breathe outs, if we want to put it like that. So there's something from me that is now part of you. It's part of you. Something of you is now part of me. When we shake hands, we share a little bit of our microbiome with the person that we've just shaken hands with. A little bit of me is now attached to you, and vice versa. So it kind of makes the picture of us as an individual fuzzy. Let's use that word fuzzy again. It makes it fuzzy. But I also want to think about the air. I just want to stick with the air, I think. It's a very useful tool in this conversation. So the air is an inanimate thing. We would label it inanimate. But it animates me and it animates you. At what point, at the breathe in of that inanimate thing, does it too become animate before we expel it to become inanimate again? So for me, this boundary is very fuzzy. I understand very poorly that a forensic scientist could, once we're dead and our bones are found in a distant wood, would be able to take elements from our bones and determine where our food had come from. And that's probably far more difficult now that our diets are sort of international. Our mango came from somewhere and our avocado came from somewhere else and our carrots may have come up from our backyard. But I think it helps us to think about the inanimate that is part of the animate thing that we are. And for me anyway, it kind of destroys this distinction between the animate and the inanimate. Which is helpful on, thinking animate, inanimate is helpful on one scale, and it's very destructive on another scale. So everything that is animate derives some form of sustenance and some form of its being from the inanimate. So I just don't like these really hard boundaries.
So one response to that is, that's beautiful, right? I'm part of, you're part of me, I'm part of you. And, if we were to go to a lab, they could, literally show us that. But is that, do you see that as the basis for a politics? Or particularly for a politics who don't intuitively accept that claim?
So I use it as a tool to try and nudge a politics towards something other than a dichotomous identity. And this is, I want to come to the we, our, us. This is one of the reasons I resist those three words, we, our, and us. When academics are writing, we will say we this, or us that, or our so-and-so. But to whom are we referring in our we, our, us? And who are we excluding in our we, our, us? So we have caused the Anthropocene. But we have not. Some people have caused the Anthropocene. To weird is in Tuck and Yang's knowledge, Tuck and Yang's imaginary, let's say. What that is a move to innocence. When you say we have caused the Anthropocene, you include everybody, even those who have not. And in doing that, those who have become less culpable in that move. The we are us can be used then for a very divisive politics as well. We are one nation helps us forget that, and I'll talk about a settler state that I've come from, helps us forget that, in fact, that we in our nation have a history of them and us, have a history of using the we as a tool for ignoring damages done, ignoring different cultural perspectives, ignoring, I'll come back to it again, violence is done. So my habit now is always to define the we if I'm writing. Who is the we that I'm writing about? Who is the us? Who is the our? And so being very, very definite about that, but also thinking very consciously about who do we exclude, we, academics, who do we exclude when we write about the we? Mm-hmm. Who do we exclude when, as individuals, we talk about we?
It's beautiful, and just moving that along to a kind of practical consideration makes me think about the fact that we don't actually fight over the air that we breathe. I mean, we might, if we were 20,000 meters under the sea, fight it with one oxygen tank or something, but we don't fight over the air we breathe. And similarly, there is a lot of international cooperation, which is about the plumbing of technology, monetary systems, financial transactions, which is less fought over, more technical, where international cooperation persists. So even as the fight over vaccines went on during COVID and the fight over resources for vaccines, people tended not to notice that the international health regulations were actually working. Countries were virus sharing. They were actually sharing information so that they could try to navigate through the virus. That as we, argue over who destroyed undersea cables as an aggressive act, we forget that actually the world keeps functioning across enemy lines in all of those parts of the so-called plumbing. But then we might not fight about the air that we breathe, but if there was only one slice of delicious chocolate cake in this room, we might fight over it. I mean, we might. And so then there's the things that human beings do fight over. And in international cooperation, that's what's drawn everybody's attention. And in particular to kind of China versus the United States. I mean, there's partly because it's so in each of those great powers' interests to force the whole rest of the world to choose that either as a country, Europe, or as a region, Europe aligns with the United States, or it aligns with China and the world. And that an unconditional alliance would be the dream of either the United States or China, because it would give them power in all their other negotiations to say, we're not just negotiating as the United States, we're negotiating as an alliance of countries that are unconditionally going to support the United States. But in my view, as somebody from a very small country, that is not in the interests of any other country in the world to do an unconditional alliance, because those two great powers look as though there is very little that will constrain them. And that the moderating force, and what gives me optimism about global order, is the idea that because each of China and the United States depend so heavily on third countries, that even if they separate from each other, they will remain completely dependent on other countries in the system. And that if those third countries understand that they have no interest, and most countries do understand, that they have no interest in choosing one way or the other, they're too dependent on both, that will be a moderating force. The so-called rise of the rest will be a moderating force, because that will be a voice that either China or the United States listens to as a moderating force. I'm not sure where this takes us for this conversation, Jonathan. That's your job as a moderator.
Well,
I'm just moving it on, you know.
Let me push back a bit. I mean, if it is, in a very fundamental sense, isn't international climate politics precisely fights about the air we breathe?
About?
The air we breathe.
The air we breathe.
Do we count historical emissions, or we only talk about present emissions? Who pays? But it's about, the air we breathe.
Right, but as you said, or Nils, sorry, I can't remember, the 4 largest emitters did not send their heads of government to Baku, to the climate negotiations, although I don't think that's the point I would make about the climate negotiations. I would say that there's a very interesting coalition of countries that nobody expected to come forwards, that are now picking up and pushing a transitional politics. And that the laggards, that the United States looks like the laggard and increasingly looks like the laggard in climate action. But again, it's the rise of the rest. I don't think 10 years ago people expected that it was the Gulf countries that would be saying by 2030 we'll be net zero. That our goal is now, as one of them says, our goal is to celebrate the export of our last barrel of oil. Whereas in the United States, it's become a sort of punishable offense for a company to say that it's got net zero, a net zero plan.
You want to say something? No.
Should we take some thoughts from the audience?
Sure. Is there a microphone? Shout, please shout.
Okay, it's about terminology. You've talked a lot about different spatial scales from the local level, and it could be our town or our sports team identity, or our national identity, continental, European or global citizenship. I mean, you've even talked in your book, Jonathan, about kind of more than human identity. And obviously, too much focus on one scale is problematic. At the individual, you have narcissism. At the football hooliganism or excessive nationalism. And at the planetary level, I think the pushback is that if you focus on the planetary, you maybe ignore the local. And I'm just, so yes, we need to reconcile and rebalance across these different spatial scales our identity. But I do wonder if the spatial is a red herring, really. It's kind of implicit is a sort of little me in a body that, and there's others over there in other countries. And, the boundaries of ourself are not scientifically supported, as we've talked about. We're deeply connected to the natural world and others, from the bacteria and fungi within us to our porous minds. So, we are nature. And I was thinking, we could say, well, we are planetary, or the planet's within us. But I think the spatial connotation is not helpful. So I guess my question is whether another term is more helpful. Nature, in particular, seems to be what you've talked around, but not actually mentioned explicitly. It's a non-spatial term, it's an apolitical term, and whether that's another framing here. Good to get thoughts on that. Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Well, so the question of spatial, the spatial problem, which I agree is really tricky, and I have not found a way out of it, because we're embodied beings. And maybe one of the problems here is that we followed Descartes and others for too long in thinking that our mind and our bodies are somehow separate. But I always have to be somewhere. I can't be nowhere. I tried once, but so I don't know a way out of that problem, but I'm curious, we just have to exist in space.
My response to your alternate word is that it again sets up a dichotomy. So we have the human, we have cultural, we have nature, nature culture. So nature for me has become a word that's actually divisive rather than encompassing. That's it. I agree. I mean, I agree with John. You know, we live in a space. Spatiality is really important. It's the same as we live within some form of temporal scale as well. It may be on Risa's part, it may be extraordinarily vast. It may be on a moth or a butterfly's scale, extremely short. But
I mean,
excuse me.
I am not an expert in political systems, but the spatial, for me, one of the things I think about as a physicist is how many spatial scales can impact other spatial scales, right? And this is sort of a fundamental thing about our universe. When we talk about how the Earth came to be, you know, there are such a range of spatial scales that from the microbes that, you know, created some of the first oxygen to, you know, the truly cosmic that, you know, that brought our galaxy together. And, you know, every day I think about, you know, spatial scales that are many, many, many orders of magnitude different from each other. And, you know, physics is different from human systems. But I do think that interplay between spatial scales still is relevant in both cases.
And I think the scale part is the part I would draw from your question. That excellent book on scale, which highlights to us that if you took a gorilla and scaled it up exactly, it wouldn't be able to function anymore. So some things scale, some systems scale and some don't, but most don't. And I think that the challenge for the planetary project on governance is which kinds of governance scale and which kinds don't. I think the world is full of failed governance experiments because the assumption is that you can take something which works at the local level and simply replicate at greater scale. We've all lived through 2 decades of an obsession with scaling up, which fails to notice that actually most things don't scale up.
I mean, isn't this, in some sense, the precise problem that we face right now is that we have these nation states, which are our primary governors, and they don't scale up. Right? But the problem, not all, but many problems right now, I mean, climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, right, operate at a scale at which the nation state is incapable of acting. And I actually would say that's at 2 scales, one at the planetary scale itself, but also at the local scale, right? Because when the pandemic hit, or when climate change happens, right, we're not really concerned about the global average temperature. We're concerned about how that plays out in a specific place, what that's doing to the Venice Lagoon, what that does to the heat waves where I live in Los Angeles. But you know, the nation state sits kind of at that meso level between kind of the problems that are operating at the macro planetary level and the way in which they play out at the micro lived level.
But doesn't the evidence around climate tell us that people are more prone, and you get more evidence of cooperation among people who are completely ideologically divided if the project is local and practical? So they'll cooperate to create a clean space, and it doesn't matter what their ideology on climate change is. But the more you try to scale up, the more you try to get people to believe that this is a planetary problem, the more ideological their view becomes, and the more difficult it becomes to get people to cooperate. And I think that's increasingly true as you get more and more polarization and more ideological divide.
But of course, this itself is a question of scale, because from Risa's perspective, the Earth is very local. So can we get our mentalities out of this? You know, is it or you know, have we just been taught to think this way? Right? We've all went to schools where we learn national histories. Right? You learn that the United States was founded in 1776 and Italian unification was in 1861, and that's the basis of our stories that we tell about our politics. Are there other stories that we could tell that would get us to think differently and then to act differently?
I mean, I do think, coming back to the question you asked me earlier about how my work changes how I think about things, I do think that is a case where my work does change how I think about, climate change and our impact on the planet, right? I do really think about that question in the context of, our planet's entire history and the unique way that we are, impacting the planet. And I do think that way, when we have an atmospheric river coming through San Francisco in an unusual way, right? Because that is fundamentally tied to the way, we, over the last 100 years, have impacted our own planet.
How do we get, I have this image in my head of a movie in which there are two gangs of angry young men beating the hell out of each other, and an elderly woman standing going, use your words, boys, use your words, right? It's sort of like, how do we make the leap? How do you, no, I mean that genuinely, like, how can you bring people to, how do you think we bring people to that?
I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I do find that the beautiful thing about the cosmic story that we have in the modern scientific world is it is quite beautiful and awe-inspiring. And I think it does give us a sense of place. For me, that sense of place, very much is that Earth is an incredibly special planet that, as far as we know, is the only one within, at least within the distance that our radio signals could have traveled there and back. So, we are certainly special within, a few hundred light years of, what we are. And so that sense of place, I do think it's inspiring. I would love to hear everyone's creative ideas about how we share that more broadly.
I probably shouldn't ask this, sorry, Jonathan, but do planetary scientists fight with each other?
Oh, all kinds of scientists fight with each other, yes. In very human ways.
I mean, I think we keep coming back to this point that we are simultaneously planetary creatures, that we're simultaneously products of a cosmic history that goes back at literally an atomic level to 13.8 billion years ago, but we also find ourselves to be human. And it's I think one of the big challenges right now is that we have, our political blinders on. We think in terms of, my team versus your team. But at the same time, whether we want to accept it or not, whether we want to work with it or work against it, it is about exchange. There is a fundamental fact of exchange and interconnection that grounds us, that allows us to live. So I think one of the big tasks, really, for us as a species is to reconcile these two dimensions.
Is it just the species? Last night I overheard you talking about a multi-species treaty. Tell us about, what?
So one of the ways in which we at the Institute are trying to think through these issues is, and actually Christine we spent the last 3 days debating among a group of political philosophers and lawyers how we might think in terms of putting human beings in the context of all the other species we live in. How might we constitute at a constitutional level a politics that accounts for all of that? Anyway, we don't have time to get into the whole thing. But yeah, so I mean, these are questions we're actively working on and trying to work through, and not because I think we have the answer. wholeheartedly believe that the 8 of us solved it. But we want to provoke other people to think about it, to ask this question, to take a step back. You're like, wait a minute, you're right. We all do share air. We all do live on the Earth, with the Earth, through the Earth. That we have, we all do have dark matter passing through our bodies. How might we do things differently, given that we know that? Because, right, the political institutions that we live with, and which are built on a certain set of ideas, and these are the political ideas, political ideologies we live with, were more or less formed when this building was built. When this building was built, we had no idea what Risa told us before. And though this building survives, the question is whether the political institutions that were founded on the principles of that era, still work given what we now know, but also what we're now experiencing in terms of climate change, in terms of pandemics, right? That we're experiencing more and more the effect of the planet, and let me take that back. I think for a long time we were all very aware of the planet because before modernity there was no choice. But we're now maybe, and this is I think the big question, emerging out of a period where we were basically blinded by modernity, where we thought that the planet was elsewhere, that it didn't really affect us. So whether this is in fact happening, whether we're seeing the early stages of this happening or not, is to me an open question that we'll see play out over the coming decades. Whether humanity comes to grips with our place on this planet in the vast menagerie of species that range from slime molds to blue whales. I don't know. No.
Cosmically enhanced to gigantic proportion and shrunk to non-human insignificance. Very liberating. My question to the panel, in response to many of the issues you raised, is what about the Gaia hypothesis of back to the 1970s? Lynn Margulis and John Lovelock are raising these questions. It is the air, it is the atmosphere, it is what we share bodily and in terms of breathing. And it self-regulates. The cosmos does not ask our permissions to self-regulate. And self-regulate means climate change, floods, water bombs, tornadoes. For Lynn Margulis, who unfortunately dies way too young, she dies in her 50s, and is immediately forgotten because she challenged the genetic, hegemony of her scientific community of the day. She was much more for cooperation and coexistence, so she's immediately set aside. John Lovelock lives to 101 and transmutes into a die-hard transhumanist. So the Gaia hypothesis gets forgotten, but it was both an ethical and a political system. It told us things. How do you feel about it?
Hi, and I'm going to add a question as well. Thanks for the great opening panel. And this is a question that I'm not under the illusion will necessarily be answered right here, but perhaps something that could be considered in other panels and conversations going forward. But the question that came to mind listening to you all is whether it's possible that there is a tension or even potentially a contradiction between human flourishing and planetary flourishing. And what we would then do if there is such a tension or contradiction. I mean, it seems like a lot of what we're talking about are, on one hand, human problems that need addressing, pandemics. We're also talking about climate change with respect to how it affects human life and our human societies. And we're looking for solutions that allow human societies to continue living in the way that we want to live. But from a planetary perspective, from the way you're describing that, it seems to me like we wouldn't even know how our solutions necessarily even affect those planetary systems, given their complexity. Like, everything we're describing about the planetary systems are...
Can I cut you off? We have like 2 minutes left, so we can answer the question.
Yeah, of course, I'll leave it at that, I'm sorry.
Christine, you grinned, so I'm going to make you answer.
How foolish it was for me to grin. Look, I think the work of Lovelock and Margolis is very important. I don't think it has been forgotten. I think it is inconvenient for a lot of people, and so it's become perhaps subsumed, or it's become relevant, useful in some circles, but inconvenient in others. So it's my very short answer to that. Humans cannot flourish if the planet does not flourish. Any notion of planetary well-being, any notion of planetary justice, any notion of multi-species justice does not exclude humans. It includes humans. It is about human flourishing within a flourishing system. Okay?
And so I know we've got 1 minute left. So my takeaway from this discussion, for the discussion over the next 2 days, is, I guess, is 3 questions. One is planetary about identity? And if so, what is that identity? Is it hydrogen? Is it human? Is it interspecies? Like, what is the identity we're trying to call up and breathe life into? Is planetary about processes and how humans organize themselves, in which case this question of scale to me is absolutely critical, that we properly understand what can scale and what can't. Or is planetary about a vision? Is it a cold vision? Is it a warm vision of what humans can be that would in some way be kind of mobilizing and motivating for human beings? And how would you do that?
I mean, I think that's the goal for the weekend. Let's, well, you know, because it's all of the above, and we got to figure out how this works. So I think with that, thank you all. This was a total pleasure.
Thank you.